Okay, so the second part of this event continues where we left off, and we are now going to talk about the vision paper that we've developed at the IEP in collaboration with a number of think tanks from different member states in Europe, and also some additional experts as well, many of whom are here today. So first, we've got David Baldock, who has been collaborating and leading this work with myself and the team at IEP. David is the senior fellow at the Institute, and he's a former director. He was tasked in the 1980s with setting up IEP's agricultural program. So his experience on the CAP goes back a long way. And he's now going to present our core ideas, which are in the vision paper that we're launching today.
Thanks a lot, Harriet. Unlike most people, I actually like agriculture policy. It's interesting. It's about life and death. It's about the future of the planet, you know. Gets a bad press, don't believe it. It's very nice to see everyone here today. I'm going to sketch out a rationale and a potential model for how we think the CAP part of this equation should work. And we obviously recognize, and it's important to say, that the CAP is not the only part of a sustainable food and agriculture future. It's absolutely only one dimension. Extremely important to understand we're part of a food system. It's where the demand side is critical. You can't change the supply side without changing the demand side. We recognize that it will need other sources of finance and regulation and advice and so forth. So let us not see the CAP as the only sacred cow, the thing that has to shift and the doors are all open. It's an important part of the picture, but it's not the only one. Okay, if I could have my first slide. Much of what I was going to say here has been said by the panel already, so thank you, panel. We are not looking post-2027 to the exact challenges we've had in the last few years. It is a different world. There is a sense of urgency. Agriculture and rural land use has to meet a much larger suite of challenges than it's had to do in the past. You can't take agriculture and land use out of the climate solution. You can't take it out of the biodiversity solution. You can't take it out of the health solution. It cannot be a separate box. And at the moment, it's too much of a separate box. And as Arta said, by 2035, we should be having a climate neutral sector. And that is a big, big deal. We're extremely far from that today. Why is the CAP important? Obviously, it's the key framework for the finance, but it also provides policy leadership, the sense of direction, where are we going? A short moment to reflect on how might things be different by the time we get to 2027. Again, the panel have done an excellent job introducing that subject. I'm going to mention a couple of other things. In my lifetime in the CAP, which as Harriet said is longer than one might really want to admit, enlargement has always been an important trigger for thinking and change. And I think that will happen again. If we are going to have a new opening of Europe to the east, whether it's exactly full membership or whatever it is, the inclusion of Ukraine and also other Western Balkan states changes the game. You cannot continue with direct payments as they are with just putting Ukraine into the system. 41 million hectares totally changes the budgetary allocations in Europe. It tips a lot of member states into being net contributors instead of net beneficiaries. This is a big deal, and undoubtedly people inside the Council, the Commission, will be thinking now about actually how we deal with this in the MFF and the CAP. It's not only foreign affairs, it's domestic affairs. Technology, secondly, very briefly. This changes agriculture. It makes it more possible to do some of the things we want to do. It changes the demand side, and we haven't talked about novel proteins, but we certainly are seeing rapid changes in certain sectors of the consumption side, and we expect to see more of that. It's less difficult to imagine significant changes in dietary patterns than it would have been a few years ago. And it's also very important to say that technology makes it possible to actually monitor and engage in detailed policy delivery in a way it wouldn't be in the past. We can monitor change without having to send endless inspectors out on to look at every hedge on a farm. So there's actually a bit more of a tool to operationalize policies. That's important as well. Generational change, we've heard about already, and one thing I just want to say there is that means new, younger farmers coming into play, and they want a different world. And Melanie's already said this about her son, and I think that's true of a lot of people. So there is a new opportunity as well as a huge adjustment problem. And then finally, the food chain, and we have not heard really this morning about the food industry. They are important players, and I mean retailers as well as processors. They need to be part of the system. It would have been helpful in a way if we'd had a vigorous SFS, as Faustine said, on the horizon from the Commission, which actually was providing some kind of European set of drivers to help the food industry have a sense of direction in this. We may well not have that, but we certainly need the food industry engaged. So, nonetheless, the CAP's important, it's worth talking about, it's worth a considerable amount of our attention. And why are we concerned now? We've heard about this morning. If we delay the adjustment to what we can see of a totally new set of challenges until the next CAP, or even worse, until the CAP in the 2030, mid-30s, it's just simply too late to meet the challenges. So it does absolutely oblige us to think about what's happening now, and certainly in the 2027 period. And we have not had, in this CAP, the hope for alignment between the Green Deal and the CAP. And it's not, people haven't tried, but it just hasn't really happened. And we've heard about that before. And we need that alignment. And in any case, I think if we want to retain funding for rural areas, then the funding model has to actually capture the totality of real interest and challenge in those rural areas. It isn't just about those large farmers, which are basically the main beneficiaries of a policy at the moment. It's not really a politically viable project either. So, as everyone has said, a lot is possible under the new development model. The member states have got a lot more scope to do, to amend their policies, but it simply isn't happening. So why is that? Why is it that already we can see we're not actually going to be able to meet the kind of targets we've been talking about? So, in brief, firstly, there's a problem of direct payments. They dominate the expenditure. They dominate the mindset. They mean that farmers are looking to retain those payments. Agriculture ministries are looking to fight for those payments. It gets in the way of innovative thinking, and they simply don't deliver against key objectives either. So they are a huge obstacle in the way of progress. Secondly, we see a mindset in the Agri-Fish Council in particular against change. And just one symptom of that is the whole episodes we've had the last 2 to 3 years around the GAC derogations and using the Ukraine conflict where convenient or otherwise to say, well, agriculture is under such pressure, we have to set aside environmental obligations. Environmental obligations start to look just a form of irritating constraint. but they're not. If we have a clear sense of direction, we need to be able to keep to a clear set of baselines for support and not keep changing them. Then we've heard already about the lack of sufficient ambition in member states. And part of that, I'm sorry to say, is that the environmental measures, which have grown in size substantially, which is a very big achievement, and we need to emphasize that. Since I started, it's a massive change, and that's to be welcome. But they're not environmentally, they don't add enough value, and quite a lot of the studies we've seen have shown that. It's too much rewarding farmers for business as usual, lack of change. There's not enough money for the more ambitious projects. There's not a willingness to take risks, to have measures which actually might make a big difference. And we see this preference for status quo in agriculture ministries in particular. And we know that in discussions, when national ministries are talking about how they're going to put together their CAP strategic plans, a lot of the discussion about how do we change as little as possible and persuade the Commission, that's fine. And that is literally what a lot of member states do. We know that's the case. There simply isn't the impetus inside that system to move along. Of course, there are exceptions. So we end up with a lack of real incentives for member states to address sustainability. There's no penalty, as Arthur said. There's not really the additional system. So in other words, if we continue like this, we have a framework, a governance system, a set of incentives for the key players, which isn't going to produce change on its own. So we have to think of changes to that structure. We have to imagine how we could change the system of incentives so that the way that CAP money is spent is different. If you look now at the current expenditure on the main interventions, the main measures, you see the top line, there's direct payments, and there are quite a few other measures, which I won't go through on this graph, which also in the same direction. And we still have very significant expenditure on coupled support, a lot of which is actually quite perverse in relation to the direction of travel. So, if we want to boil this down brutally to some major shortcomings. First, direct payments. Secondly, insufficient focus on sustainability, particularly at the member state level, where there are a lot of competing priorities. The current CAP has 9 different objectives, so it's very difficult to say in the Commission, well, to criticize a particular intervention of a member state, because it could be justified under one of 9 different measures. We don't have a sharp focus. And we have an agri-centric governance model. That means that there's too much of a system whereby people with an interest in defending the status quo make the key decisions, and they're not exposed to the arguments and the presence and the science from a wider community. So what would be the right priorities for the CAP in the next decade? Well, we've identified 4. First is the transition aid. That means filling in the gap that's already been mentioned between where we want to go and how we get there. A lot of farmers face a risk of making management change. They know roughly what they could do, but they may be going through a period of 4 or 5 years. You're switching to a lower input system. You're picking up whatever regenerative system looks appropriate on your farm. You think that you're probably taking more risks with your yields. You're probably taking more risks that the technology may not be right for you, may not match your farm, it may not match your market. You don't know exactly what your market's going to pay. You're exposed there. So the issue here is how we help farmers get through a transition period. And that's also about knowledge, as Melanie said earlier. So that's our pot number 3, how we actually get the advice, we build the structures, we build the supportive environment in which those farm decisions are made. So one, transition aid, that, in our view, is a time-limited aid. It's potentially, let's say, over 7 years. It's the kind of time period that's convenient in the EU. It's not sacred. That we say, okay, we're really going to help farmers. After that, the market's got to work for you. You don't expect special aid forever. Second need is the long-term requirement for environmental services, public goods. The clearest possible example of that is biodiversity. We've seen in the nature restoration debate all the different categories of land. And we are going to see a huge need to move peatland out of agriculture, or to re-wet peat on a big scale in Europe. When you see the map of peat in Europe, it's terrifying. It's very, very large. And we are going to need to, therefore, do a lot of nature restoration here, and we need some long-term funding for that. And finally, this research and innovation. So, can we imagine a version of the CAP, a funding model which actually is focused precisely on those 4 needs? Now, there are different ways of doing that. What we've tried to do is sketch out one particular way of doing it, which puts the focus on those objectives and doesn't worry about the fact that it's a big change from the status quo, that it may be difficult to imagine actually the government system working. I think it's absolutely important to see, okay, well, what could we see which would deliver a completely different set of incentives for people, a different framework in which choices are made. So we've come up with a model here. We don't pretend that this is a blueprint for the future. This is what's got to happen. It's a major exercise to work this through. And our argument is this exercise needs to be started now. So we've really explored those models properly in the way we're just not doing at the moment, and fully appreciating what they involve. And in our model, there's a central new role for the European Sustainable Land Management and Transition Fund. So that's a new fund. And what's different about that is instead of having 9 objectives, it's absolutely focused on environmental services and transition. And that's it. There aren't any other objectives. There aren't any other justifications for intervention. That's what if you're in a member state, if you want to get the money, that's what you're going to have to put forward to the Commission. That's how you justify it. It's a new fund. It's a new start. Some of these historic issues of allocation of the budget between member states, one can think freshly about. Alan mentioned this morning, and I agree that can be difficult. It's designed to reduce barriers to change and also offer a long-term basis for land management. Instead of it being separate from the Farm to Fork goals, it's much more closely aligned with them. Member states would be expected to show how they were going to deliver that, so there will be more of that roadmap, which is kind of missing at the moment. It needs to have realistic payments to farmers, which are actually going to produce the kind of returns that make it possible. If we want to have high enough take-up of voluntary measures, we need to pay enough. And it needs to be funded from somewhere. One place it should be funded for is by phasing out direct payments. We've suggested phasing them out over 7 years, with one exception I'm going to come back to. But it would also need additional funds, just feeding in the revenues from phasing out direct payments is not enough money. We also need money from other sources, and that's going to be a blended source. We talked a bit about that already. Some of that will be private, some of it will be through a carbon market of some sort. Some of it will be for the private sector come in. Some of it will be from the member states. Member states already, we've seen huge sums of money mentioned in the Netherlands and Germany, for example, in terms of looking at change. We have several sources of money. We need to talk about it. So how would the new framework work? Well, instead of being arranged essentially around the 2 existing funds, the AGF and the EFRD, we would have, on the one hand, a new Sustainable Land Management Fund. That would be starting with a certain amount of money, building up progressively over 7 years, fed by money coming across from direct payments and from other parts of the CAP, probably from coupled support as well. On the other side of the equation, we have a continued slimmed down cap because it's losing its direct payments. We totally accept, though, that there is real rural poverty. There are farms where we have extreme income requirements in particular parts of Europe, particular sectors. And we would need to have a much more targeted, much more precise system of aid for such farms, which would be in our second box on the right-hand side as you see it there. And they would be coupled to an ongoing and vigorous rural development policy. That's an important part of the CAP. No one is arguing against that. That needs to be kept in place. And there are other issues as well in the CAP, which again, we haven't discussed in detail, including the need for some kind of crisis reserve, some kind of way of managing shocks to the system. So the key point here is to separate out the money which is for this new agenda, and this does mean a governance change as well. And our suggestion is this will not happen with the Agri-Fish Council in charge of this. It has to be different. So this new fund would be managed by environment and climate authorities. They'd have time to build up their capacity, which they would need to do. And of course, agri-type authorities would be involved as well. Whereas on the other side of the diagram, agriculture policy remains very much led by agricultural authorities, and there needs to be coordination between the two. So that's an important change in governance and in responsibility. And this, therefore, has implications very much for the MFF. It's not only simply the CAP, they're very much combined. So if I go on to the next slide. So if we have a model like that, how do we actually provide the political context for member states to vote for this? And that does need to happen. So we agree that some kind of grand débat, as we put it, I think this is actually an idea came from, there was a phrase from our French colleagues, so forgive my accent here, is about the sustainability transition. This, I think, is slightly different to what the President of the Commission was talking about, which sounded a bit more like a dialogue between the Commission or the member states and farmers. We're talking about a much more inclusive discussion, a little bit like we had on the panel just now this morning. That's the kind of debate we need to have with the different actors involved. And that does mean member states fully involving themselves in this. And we've seen this starting to happen in Germany and some other member states. We see some interesting developments, and we can draw on experience in England, which has definitely gone through some of the highs and lows of this experience. We are not without models, we're not without experience, we can do things. Then, of course, we need to adopt the necessary farm-to-fork objectives and the uncertainty, which is dragging on and on and on. We've left some of these difficult farm-related farm-to-fork measures till late in the Commission's mandate, and they're paying a price for that. This certainty needs to be put back in place. And the 2040 climate targets are a very, very important part of that, which we'll see next year. And then there's the question of how we start the discussion in Europe. And what I think we're suggesting here is that it will require preparatory work. And in our paper, we've suggested some areas. How do we target money appropriately on socioeconomic? How do we actually get more results? How do we increase member state ambition? How do we monitor in a cost-effective way? How do we encourage farmer cooperation without being too heavy-handed about this? There are lots and lots of issues about this. How do you increase the skills of environment ministers to actually manage a process like this? Those are sort of discussions we need to have. And we also would like to see member states starting to engage on this now rather than waiting until 2027. And some of them are, and they have got a lot of flexibility under the new deal. That's not really the problem. They can move along faster if they want to. But rather than having totally fragmented debates about particular national preoccupations, which is understandable, we need to see them actually coming into some alignment with the European objectives. So I think at the end of the day, our suggestion here is as we enter this period of debate and reflection and dialogue in Europe, we cannot exclude from that dialogue a more radical version of the CAP with a different governance, a different structure we've got at the moment. That can't be something which is okay, fine for NGOs to dream about on Friday afternoon. Actually, it should be more central to the agenda. It's got something to give serious consideration to, something to be worked through in some fashion. That needs to be there in the grand débat. It needs to be there in the impact assessment process. It needs to be there in the institutional work. It needs to be there in Horizon programs. We have a governance. We have a governance gap. We have a failure to align our delivery system for the single biggest element in the EU's budget with our long-term objectives. So that's the challenge, and we hope that people will take that up. Not a blueprint, but it's certainly something which needs really, really serious consideration. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you, David, and I hope that would definitely trigger a discussion. So before we hear from you and your questions, we are also going to hear the perspectives from the partners that we've been working with to develop this vision in different member states. So we're really happy that we have quite a few of them here today. And they are just going to reflect on what does this vision mean from their perspective, as a national perspective, how could this be made to work? So first, Inma Batada. She is a researcher at the Basque Center for Climate Change, BC3. So she'll be telling us about the Spanish perspective.
Nowadays in Spain we have a very polarized debate in agriculture sector, especially with some environmental requirements and how different groups see the future of food production. The development of agriculture in Spain is closely linked in the context of the European Union, being a strategic sector for an important number of Spanish population. From BC3, we find that how this vision is presented could be an opportunity to build bridges between these different parts to strengthen climate goals in the agri-food sector. We agree that the evolution of the CAP sustainable requirements in recent years have managed to implement measures with an impact on soil protection, biodiversity, or other environmental aspects that would have been unthinkable years ago, such as, example, the cover crops. Nevertheless, they have not had a significant impact and has been seen in different studies and could be even greater. So we consider that this vision can support a more ambitious transition. Spain is already suffering the effects of climate change. As for water scarcity, desertification, fires, heat waves more recurrently. This vulnerable condition affect food production with many impacts, especially in markets where farmers and consumers are the first affected. Also for us, adaptation measures have a key role in the future of agricultural production. We cannot have green agriculture having red numbers, not only in farmers, also in consumers. So this vision could cover this scenario, the transition fund, the crisis reserve, and the structural support in case. This vision could have the opportunity to have coherence in terms of land use, land management, and land demand, having a broader perspective with consonance between different land uses, which is necessary in the current debate, and we have talking about this morning. So in spite of administrative deadlines, sooner or later we will have to opt for sustainable solutions through the world food system. It is better to be aware in the process and have a room for decision than to have to face solutions suddenly without a contingency plan and without any margin, neither of time nor of technology. Thank you.
Aurélie Catelot, who is the Director for Agriculture and Food Policies at IDRI. So she'll be speaking from the French perspective.
Exactly. I'm sure you all know that the CAP is very important for France, both politically and financially, to support our farming sector. But at the same time, the findings that David recalled about the weaknesses of the current CAP do apply to the case of France. Improvements from the French CAP strategic plan are insufficient in relation to the social and environmental challenges that our food system must face. Just to name a few of them, France does not manage to seriously reduce the use of pesticides and chemical fertilizers, nor to seriously develop the production of protein crops, while sustainable cattle livestock is declining, for example. In this situation, to me, the questions that IEP's paper raised, let's say for random French stakeholder, are: is it possible to modify the funding structures of the CAP to meet the challenges of a truly sustainable agriculture without jeopardizing the economic viability of French farms? Or in other words, can a reform of the CAP as proposed by IEP paper be the armed wing of the required just transition of the French food and farming sector? And to answer positively to these questions, I think at least one condition must be met. France must go out of the competing priorities situation that David mentioned earlier. Like, for instance, aiming at being the most sustainable while being very competitive on international markets, or stopping imports while keeping a high level of exports, etc. France is, of course, the main beneficiary of CAP funds, but even for us, CAP funds are not unlimited. It cannot finance anything and everything. So, however, in France, the public debate about the future of our food system is as open to, for instance, a technofit narrative as to a diversified or employment-dense narrative. There is not enough money to finance both, but maybe there is enough money to finance the transition towards one of them. This is the reason why the proposition of a European grand débat that has been put forward in IEP's paper particularly resonates in the French context. And it seems that we have a great opportunity to make this grand débat happen with Ursula von der Leyen's announcement about a strategic dialogue on the future of agriculture in the EU. So let's hope this is going to be the opportunity that will allow us to prepare the set in France for a serious CAP reform post-2027.
Thank you, Aurélie. Now, Simone Reuter, she's the project leader for food at the Danish think tank Concito.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm also going to give some perspectives and from Denmark on this vision paper. And to first kind of set the scene, I want to share a bit about the Danish agriculture as it is today, some of the challenges. Today, agriculture emissions take up 34% of our total national emissions. And looking towards 2035, it's projected that it will take off 55% of our total national emissions, because the emissions is going down, but not as fast as within the other sectors. Looking at biodiversity, there is a continuous decline, and there is only 2.3% of the area that's protected for nature, which is quite low. On animal welfare, Copenhagen University did a study on what level the Danish production is, and it's a bit above the EU rules, but when compared to our neighboring countries, especially for pigs, it's quite lower. So there is also some challenges with animal welfare. On the other hand, to say some of the more positive things, we have managed to produce 30% more agriculture products since 1990 and reduce emissions 16%. And this has been done through a lot of research and innovation with public and private partnerships, where the focus has been much on efficiency and productivity. Also, there's been now introduced a lot of more environmental regulation on nitrogen leakage and pesticides regulation, even though it's not sufficient yet. So there is a need to look at this opportunity of a new fund, and the Danish government is now looking at introducing a tax on agriculture emissions, introduced at the production level or at the consumption level, to actually see whether we can reduce the emissions. But this is not going to be enough to also what is it called, reduce the impact on other ecosystems and provide more benefits for biodiversity. So that's why we think this new fund could be a great opportunity in also a Danish context, and come from a frugal member state. I expect that the government would be in favor of a more greener cap and a more efficient way of using the money, but also if the budget doesn't increase, would be probably their most, what they would prefer. Thank you.
Thank you. And now moving to Germany, we have Nikolai Pushkarev, who is the manager for EU policy for food and land use at Agora Agra.
Yeah, thanks so much. I would like to briefly provide actually three concrete examples of initiatives in Germany that relate to the financing of the transition in the agri-food system, which of course relates very much to the main topic of IEP's Great Paper. And the first being, which is maybe more widely known, the government has committed in its coalition agreement to present a concept for a cap after 2027 that would be gradually phasing out hectare-based payments in favor of payments for environmental and other public goods, so more performance-oriented. That's being the first. Second, okay, that's looking into the future. Secondly, what's actually going on now, and Arthur mentioned it already, there is a funding scheme being developed to help a transition in the pig sector towards higher animal welfare. And this includes both investment support for the refurbishing of stables and a compensation per pig held in these higher animal welfare conditions. And this is linked to a recently adopted mandatory labeling system, which has 5 categories, ranging from the highest category being organic to the lowest, which is kind of regular indoor systems, you could say. And then the funding would be linked to the 3 highest categories. So it's kind of reminiscent of the egg method of production system. Although, so there's, I think, around 1 billion for 4 years committed, but there's not yet a long-term commitment, which raises some questions in the country. And thirdly, for peatland rewetting, which has also been mentioned, the German Climate and Transition Fund has 2 measures in the making, of I think one of 800 million, one of 200 million, up to 2026, to start this rewetting process. Again, not yet a very long-term commitment, but one could be expecting things to stick for longer, hopefully. And maybe just if I have one second for a final thought on the kind of the usefulness of this grand debate or this strategic dialogue, because clearly in Germany there's been some experience with that. So there has been a stakeholder dialogue on the future of agriculture that finalized in 2021, which had, amongst others, this consensual kind of agreement on the CAP and the phasing out of these area payments. And another commission of similar nature, which is so-called the Borchert Commission, which had the animal welfare transition component. And I would say the experience shows it's super useful to have such groups and such processes, because they bring different people together. They actually really allow to have some building common ground. At the same time, it is also clear that it does not, even with a consensual position, it doesn't mean it gets directly implemented into policy. You still have a lot of politicking around. And you're not actually, it's not a given that what comes out of these groups gets implemented. The Borchert Commission recently resigned because it found that not enough progress had been made on animal welfare. And thirdly, as a last point, of course, commissions tend to gain consensus on where consensus can be had, which is great, but there might be areas which also are in need of attention that do not get this consensus, and you can't sort of only focus on the bits that have actually consensus around them. So just a few thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And now we move east. So we're going to hear from Martin Abel, who is the research fellow at AMO based in the Czech Republic.
Yes, we move east indeed. 120 hectares is the average size of a farm in my country. So it is quite likely that it is far less in yours. What does it mean? It means for the farmer that the farm is, I think, better equipped to deal with sudden crises, to to perhaps face a sudden loss of income. But at the same time, it also means more power, more market power, more political power for the farm. And so this would be my first point. That I think that what we really need to be concerned with here when we try to change the way that we produce food. Is the fact that it can be like big companies that are doing the decisions, and I think it was mentioned already by David that we have to talk about the governance in this area. That very often those who have interest in the status quo will be those who make decisions in my country, specifically where I observe a power grab of the Ministry of Agriculture by these big corporations. Now, secondly, I want to talk about regulatory failure that may be ahead of us if we believe that a bunch of EU bureaucrats can control a much bigger bunch of conservative, uninformed, and quite often also badly hurting farmers. Okay, I think that also we need to talk about really inclusion of farmers into the decision-making process, and to really make sure that that there are no because you can really kind of imagine those regulations, imagine the impact that they will have, but there are things that you will not that you will just not take into account. I'll be more concrete. I will give examples. So, for instance, with the current cap, there's now the trend to make the farms smaller, or to there's the redistributive subsidy, to really support more the smaller farms. There is a concern in my country that what this will lead to is that 120 20 hectare big farm will simply divide into 10 or 12, I don't know, and then those like small companies then will ask for those subsidies, and but in fact, in reality, it will still be that large-scale farming that we have been used to. A second example might be the fact that something that I also hear is that there's been talk about rebutting the land, obviously a super important thing, but when you have no supervision over this, what it can lead to is that the farmers create wetlands in parts of on parts of their land, but it may be on locations and sites that just don't make sense from the ecological perspective. Okay, so there's like so we subsidize them in order, and they take the money, but then the impact is minimal. So, and I don't have any answers. I don't specialize. I didn't come to give you solutions. I'm giving you questions. How are we going to do this? My third and final point is something that I think has been neglected here. And obviously, this is a complex, huge topic, and there's many things that we shouldn't neglect and can't talk about everything. But I want to really stress out the energy, the use of energy by farmers, because farms today obviously use fossil fuels in order to power the machines, and they will need more energy in the future. They'll need more electricity in the future as they're going to electrify, hopefully, the machines like tractors, and so they will be, I think, impacted even more than other industries by the increasing prices of energy, specifically electricity. So I think that we or you who try to regulate agriculture have to also bear in mind that that you can help the farmers by giving them means how to generate their own electricity, and very often it will not involve only electricity on the rooftops, rooftop sort of power plants, but it might involve also other forms of power plants, for instance, on the land. Perhaps you've heard of agrivoltaics, which allows the combined dual use of land for agriculture and energy production. So I think that we need to really explore these options as well in order to make farmers more resilient in these, I believe, difficult times. So thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So hopefully that was also, giving the range of obviously different challenges that are faced in different countries in Europe. But obviously the challenge at the EU level is to bring these together. Now we have a slot of until 12:50 to hear from you. So we'd really encourage your questions. David will will be here to answer them, and also. If you would like to pose questions to any of the panelists or any of the speakers who have just spoken from our network, you can do so too. So please just make that clear when you ask your question. And then one final request is that when you speak, when you take the floor, please do state your name and organization. Thank you.
Should I stand up? I don't know. Good morning, everyone. I'm Roberto Talenti. I'm a researcher at the European Environmental Bureau and also a PhD candidate in Italy at the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Pisa. My question is just to shed light on a sector which has been mentioned in any case, but I would like really to focus a bit more on that, which is the one which is responsible for the use of 70% of European agricultural land, which is the one which emits 52% of European methane emission, not methane emissions related to agriculture, but European methane emissions, and just provides for 22% of calories in the EU, which is the livestock sector, of course. I mean, we know that the current CAP, like the 2023-2027, doesn't do almost anything on that in terms of GAEC, in terms of eco schemes. And I've heard from you that, and I totally agree, that it's really important to stimulate a decrease in the consumption of animal food product, which is really interesting. And this is something that also the Farm to Fork strategy stresses. Nevertheless, my question is on that. I would like a reflection on this. Of course, when we have a reduction in consumption, if we want to have the desired environmental impact, positive environmental impact, we need a reduction in production. Reduction in production, which means less revenues, and which means that the livestock sector will have to shrink to some extent, and some people will have to lose their job. And so, I mean, this is a really expensive transition. This is really difficult it's really difficult to have this kind of transition for political and cultural reasons as well. So how do you manage that? How do you manage this kind of transition? How do you think it's gonna be possible to have this kind of, indeed, passage? Person will have, to lose their job and will have to maybe be, trained for new kind of sectors within the agricultural sector. So maybe the sustainable fund, which you were mentioning before, could be really interesting from this point of view. Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks very much. And by the way, people are at total liberty to make comments on our weird ideas if they want to. They don't always have to make a question. You're absolutely right. Livestock is one of the central issues in Europe, and it's extremely contentious. And I think a lot of what you say is right, but I think it's not always negative for farmers in quite the way. If you look, for example, at pig farms, which have eliminated cages, which actually are trying to work with a high welfare system, you can have more employment on some of those farms and not less. Some of the most intensive livestock producers in Europe are large corporations. The poultry sector is dominated by bigger and bigger intensive units. It's not the job of European taxpayers to support those corporations. I'm not trying to diminish the challenge for a large livestock industry. We've got a lot of small-scale dairy producers all over Europe, for example. Some of those are providing environmental services, and I think we can expect to pay for them. A lot of them aren't, and they will need to adjust their businesses. We do see the need for just transition as being particularly relevant to the livestock sector, is going to need people to change structures. There certainly will be losers. I don't think it's realistic to say everyone's going to be a winner for this. They're not. But there will be winners. And we also have to remember that some countries, like Austria, has more or less phased out battery eggs. That was possible in certain economies. We need the food sector to support this change. We need them to be paying the right prices for the truly sustainable meat. We need the right regulatory framework for novel proteins, and not just trying to block them in Europe and say, oh, no, they're too threatening to the farm sector. Actually, they have a role in a balanced diet, and I think some consumers are going to want this. So you're absolutely right. Finding the frame for that is an important challenge for us. But I don't think we should just start from the assumption that it's completely impossible to do that. I mean, when I started out in this business, for example, if you compared the UK and the EU sheep population, they were extremely stable in the UK, in France. French sheep population hadn't changed that much for quite a long time. The UK came into the CAP, higher prices, sheep numbers went up by about 50, 60% suddenly in the UK. And everyone said, oh, well, we need to keep those sheep. Well, no, actually, they were totally a product of a change in policy. That didn't happen in France, you know. So if the numbers can go up, they can also go down. You know, we can't just accept that the status quo in the livestock sector is there forever. We need to support farms, but I don't think we should imagine this is completely impossible.
Yes, first of all, thank you for the whole team for maintaining a level of ambition regarding the need to revise the CAP. We are all aware of all the environmental but also social elements that should be reconsidered completely. And I also congratulate you, David, for maintaining your excitement towards the CAP after all these decades, despite the numerous disappointments that we have faced in the previous revisions of the CAP. In your presentation, you mentioned that the eventual accession of Ukraine to the EU would be a game changer also for the common agricultural policies. Now, having followed also the EU matters for a couple of decades already, I have a feeling that we may need additional elements than purely the environmental and social reasons or justifications to achieve our goals. And Ukraine may be that answer. Because we have the political commitments from most of the member states for their accession. It's not going to necessarily happen during the next MFF, but it will eventually happen. So my question to you and all the other members of the team who prepared this report is, shouldn't we use Ukraine as the springboard for further discussions in order to introduce all the other modifications to the CAP? Because until now, the experience has been that environmental justifications are simply not enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine. We don't know how the EU is going to build its relationship with Ukraine, etc. I certainly don't know. I don't think anybody does. I do have the impression, though, that there are very serious conversations going on, not least between France and Germany, about how to accommodate Ukraine in some fashion, either in the sort of EU as it stands or in some kind of new geometry in Europe. I don't think that's just a casual conversation. It looks like a sort of structural change that we are talking about that. Now, I think what that means for the CAP is a dose of realpolitik. I think the case for changing the CAP remains, as we've discussed today and as others see it. But I think the debate about enlargement helps us to realize that no cow is sacred, that conditions can change, that actually some of the conditions which have made the CAP the way it is are not forever. And as I mentioned before, direct payments are such an important part of the CAP. They would be so heavily impacted by Ukraine's membership. We're talking about a very large area of land. We're talking about a low production cost base. We're talking about quite a dynamic sector with, to be honest, potential to produce a great deal more as well. It'll make us think about, I think, not only about the CAP, but about, as Arthur was saying, different demands on land use, about energy, and so forth. Okay, and we don't know why, but it would be difficult to imagine if you're preparing for the Commission, you're preparing for the MFF in the Commission or in a member state now, if you just weren't thinking about Ukraine. You think, okay, well, it's all business as usual. None of those parameters were used. So to me, that's the relevance of it, if that helps.
Thanks very much. Mike McKenzie from DG Agri in the Commission. And in fact, I'm one of the people who were involved with various other colleagues in designing or helping to design environmental aspects of the current CAP. I'm not about to mount a major defense of that, don't worry. I'd like to reflect on 2 points quickly, which have implied questions, but which won't get clear answers, I think. So the first one is, I would like to come back to this point of losers. I am very, very glad that this has been raised explicitly now. It was also raised implicitly during earlier discussions, which, by the way, I thought were good, had concrete points, not just a collection of generalities. We need to think, whenever we change something in policy, particularly when we change something in a big way, particularly if we're repurposing funding and maybe redistributing funding as a result, who the potential losers will be, how many losers we're prepared to accept, I mean politically and on other grounds, and what we do for them. And potentially we're not just talking about the livestock sector here. I mean, there could be others. As soon as you fundamentally change the way payments are done, what they're done for, you may be looking at quite a significant redistribution. And in cases like that, maybe not everyone can be a winner. Maybe in some cases also they were depending on certain payments to remain in a good situation with their banks, etc. There can be all kinds of implications. So, of course, you can't let a consideration of who losers will be just direct policy considerations completely from that side, but you do have to think about it. How far are you prepared to go? If you think some farmers will go out of business, how many, not in a precise figure, are you prepared to think about there? And this is not just from the point of view of what you think is good, but also of what is politically feasible, of course, when it comes down to the hard currency of political negotiations. So very, very good to think about losers as well as winners. I'm not saying that this is all a zero-sum game. We would hope to get more gains than losses, but we do have to think about that. The second very quick point is the matter of execution or implementation of policy when you do a major change. So I think it's probably fair to say that if we look at the CAP plans for the current period, if we look at plans where we think, well, more could have been achieved, is that a pure failure of design, or is it partly a failure of, is it partly an imperfection of implementation? I think in many cases it's partly the latter. Getting these plans designed and then assessing them was a big, big task. Involving quite new aspects for a lot of people. It's not hugely surprising that it wasn't perfect. If you make another big change, and I'm not saying one can't, you also have to think about, okay, how are we going to make sure that people can actually execute that well, that it can be done well? And of course, that is a question which is beyond the scope of the papers under discussion today. I completely acknowledge that. But for policy making, it is something that we always have to think about as well. But anyway, excellent discussion, and I look forward very much to reading the papers. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. And by the way, it's fine if you defend the policy. Had a lot of good sides to it, and I think we all acknowledge that, and we all acknowledge that member states have got a lot of freedom to do more than they do. On the question of losers, this is a big topic. If you're a livestock farmer in the Netherlands being offered quite enormous buyout price, you're a loser in the sense that you're losing your livelihood. But you're certainly not a loser in terms of economic thing. And if you're in any other industry, if you were the local blacksmith, the local hairdresser, you're not going to get that kind of payment. You know, there are limits to agricultural exceptionalism. You know, I think, you know, all farmers' incomes are not sacrosanct. And we have to, that is part of the equation. We have to try to distinguish between what's fair, you know, what's reasonable, and what's politically viable, quite frankly, and what isn't. But I think if we say no farmer's livelihood can ever change, we can't move on in this sector. So dealing with losers is important, but as we've seen in some member states, a willingness to pay up for losers quite readily. And I think that creates an issue in Europe as well, because then you have a big departure from the level playing field. We already have lots of departures from the level playing field. If you're a farmer in one country, you get a big buyout price, and another one, you're not going to. So I think one of the things we say in our paper that cohesion criteria are important in some of these policy things. We do have to recognize that difference, that state aid will be available in some places and not others, and European policy should therefore have some sensitivity to that and be willing therefore to tilt some payments in the direction of those parts of Europe where the local resources are much less, and farmers are going to get less aid, if that makes sense. And you're right that it can be difficult to imagine these changes, but if we don't do that now, sufficiently ahead of a reform process, we lose ourselves in a kind of pragmatic debate about changes at the margin, and I think our contention is that's not enough. You know. Right. I think. Might have been. Oh no. Sorry, but Susanna. No. Okay. No. Go for it. Let's say you choose. Yeah.
Thank you, Ed Davey, WRI, Food and Land Use Coalition. Thank you so much to IEP. This has been incredibly inspiring and interesting. I've got a couple of questions, if I may. One for David on the politics and the sequencing here of a grand bargain. What do we go for now over the next 9 to 12 months vis-a-vis the next 2 to 3 years, vis-a-vis the next 7 sort of thing? And are there examples in recent European policy making where a coalition of the willing involving farmers and policymakers and NGOs and others have really come together to drive a kind of grand bargain in other sectors, or this one? If I may, one for Artur, I don't know if we've got time, but on the carbon price, completely agree with you, and I'm just wondering whether thought is being given to how to make that the most progressive as possible, redistributive, etc., not falling on the poorest. And then Aurélie and Nikolai, the French-German partnership here, if there's a grand débat in both countries, how will those two countries work to drive le grand débat here in the EU as a whole? Thoughts on that? Thanks.
I think it's a good challenge. You know, what are the precedents for kind of a big European debate on something. I'm not sure I have an easy answer to that. I don't know if any of my colleagues are. I mean, in some areas, we have brought about very, very big changes in policy, which I think I'd include the whole climate debate being part of this. This came from the margins of European discussion into completely center stage. And it did take some time. I mean, Arthur would give but we got to a position by the beginning of this commission where it was center stage. And you would not have predicted that from a kind of traditional political, anatomy of the EU. That wasn't clear that could happen. So I think that is a good example of how the EU can actually take on board something strategic and somewhat uncomfortable and do it. I mean, organizing a grand débat is a bit of a challenge. So we need to think how to do that, but at least if we have some of the enabling conditions of having all the stakeholders wanting this, and having some leadership. I mean, I'd like to see some more leadership in the stakeholders, in the member states. And to be fair to Ursula von Leyen, not everyone's happy with everything she was saying in the State of the Union address, but she has provided a lot of leadership in the EU. We've seen things happen which would not have been expected before. Huge amounts of borrowing money on a huge scale, for example, which was totally new. So we need a bit more of that sort of leadership.
Thanks a lot. Marco Montiero from Greenpeace. So I'll try to transform into questions a few reactions. First, I find it extremely positive, the idea of the new fund, especially because of the new governance aspect. The idea of having two different funds governed by two different kind of policymakers, I think, is extremely positive. I'd even add maybe try to deal with a conflict of interest problem in the European Parliament. The last cap, as previous ones, have been designed by people that receive the money from the policy they design, and I think this is excessive. And I hope that the debates that von der Leyen suggests will take place soon or next year will be managed by a variety of DGs. And not just because, I fully know how much work you put on the cap, and positive work. And then I wanted to ask a question. How is it possible for the new cap to build a race to the top for member states? Because the current cap, the problem I see in the current cap is that it really set the rules for a race to the bottom. And the second and last question is about banks. Could the next cap address the role of banks in driving a transformation? Because for the time being, and we've seen it in the Netherlands, banks are not really driving a transformation. They are maintaining business as usual. Sorry.
Okay, thanks very much for those two questions. I think just doing the second one quickly first. I completely agree that banks are a problem, and very often, although they claim they're helping environmental transition, often actually they treat them as investment as high risk problems, and actually charge higher rate of interest on other things. So we do need it. I don't think that will come through the cap, although it would help if there was absolute crystal clear direction of travel in the EU and in the cap, saying this is what the policy wants, this is where you're going to get aid from through the cap. That would help the banks see the direction of travel, but we might need other measures beside that, I think. Sorry, what was your first? I got too excited about the banks.
On governance,
yeah.
You answered. The idea is the race to the top.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's a good. Well, we're hoping a model like this might help to motivate, because there would be a requirement to link the member state proposition to clear environmental outcomes. I mean, we discussed very much at a point that Alan mentioned and I think Arthur mentioned as well, is it practical to actually have a premium, a different way of allocating the funds? You know, should there be a reserve? I mean, I think there's quite a lot of disagreement on that point. Some people think that would be a very effective way of doing it, keeping some of the money back. Other people think, no, the member state's never going to agree to that, and therefore that's a bit of a pipeline. I think that's a debate to have. I can see nods and winks, and yeah, that would be interesting. But I agree, it's a problem.
I'm Michael Schmidt. I work for the Greens in the European Parliament. I have three interrelated points with a few implied and also explicit questions. First of all, wouldn't it make more sense for the public debate to more strongly emphasize the need for adapting agriculture to climate change? Because I think myself, a peasant boy, I come from a mainstream farm in Germany where I grew up in the 1980s, where we did horrible things to, take out the last elements of biodiversity from the farm. And I think now the farming community has understood that this is not a way to go, and that future farming has to look a little bit more like your cover page here of your brochure. So I think that including difficult issues like restoring nature and so on, if it's reframed as part of the adaptation necessity, I think we could win over more people for the transformation. And that would be the first point. The second point linked to that is agroforestry. It seems to me that part of the adaptation and more generally the transformation of agriculture is a very comprehensive agroforestry approach, which, and that leads me to the third point, is highly productive but also more labor intensive. In most cases. And there I would point out to one shortcoming of your paper is that you don't seem to have factored in the need to look at the social dimension and maybe to include in future patterns of payments or structures of payments labor intensity. So why not also reward farms that employ a lot of people in decent conditions, number of hours worked, etc., etc. These are my three points. Thank you.
Okay, well, it's great to have these challenges. You're absolutely right about adaptation, and we do talk about this in our paper, and I omitted to say that, and I should have done. We do see that as actually a very important part of what should be addressed in a new fund. It's a critical condition for future production in Europe. We have better water management, for example, better soil management, and farmers with more resilient businesses, and actually more support through the industry to deal with uncertainty. This can't always be done purely by bigger and bigger and bigger crisis reserve to deal with everything. So you're absolutely right. On the labour intensity issue, just briefly, we certainly see the value of agricultural employment. There's always a difficulty here that what we want is jobs which add value, which are in good conditions, which are well paid and are meaningful. We don't want to just create employment for its own sake as a sort of artifact of policy, which is going to be disappeared. I mean, employment per se is not a public good, as economists say. So I think what we need to be clear about is how we have resilient businesses which can really justify the right level of employment and get that right. And we certainly have a lot of people in rural areas for whom really secure, well-paid jobs are important. So I do see that as part of the just transition framing we tried to put forward, but easier to say than to do.
Hi, David. I'm Justin Zara. I'm from Environmental Defense Fund Europe. And until about a year ago, I was actually, for many, many years, running a paying agency in my member state of origin, which actually pays EU farmers. So I was involved in quite a bit of the past 3 reforms. And I would put it to you that on the issue of how to make the transition a just transition for farmers, we need to look at it, I think, the other way around. Because the problem, or let's say the certainty about what the current and the previous HAPs have been delivering, is in a staggering way what was shown on Artur's first slides, which is a reduction of the number of farmers of about 37% in the past 15 years. And I think the reasons for that are that we, as a collective sector made some choices when we had the opportunity to make a cap that could work even for small and medium farmers, who constitute most of the farmers, but farm less than half of the actual agriculture area, by the way. And that is, I think, one of the leading problems. We chose to go for something else. So there was a policy briefing in 2011 from the Commission, which put the idea of switching direct payments to an income stabilization model, such as is practiced in Canada, as one of the leading ways to safeguard farmer livelihoods and enable them to adopt better practices, be better resilient, and cater for what the market is actually saying. We threw that out of the window and we decided to just keep the per hectare system and to add coupled income support to that. And we also had some other key moments. I think we had the friend speaking from the Czech Republic. Once, I think that the Commission actually proposed in the reform document for 713 to have a maximum ceiling for direct payments of 200,000 euros. There would have been a very strong redistributive effect for that, which would have liberated a lot of money for the good things in Pillar 2 at the time, or to make something work better for smaller farmers. Again, we decided that that was out of the window, and I have never actually even heard it being proposed again. And maybe that is a bit of a consequence of the influence of the main voice of European farmers, which when you actually look at the figures, represents probably only about 4% of farmers, and those are mostly the biggest and most industrialized farms. And when you start speaking to farmers and asking them what it would take for them to change practices, you start to hear some very counterintuitive things, because it actually does not depend so much on the aid that you give them or the aid intensity, because what they actually see is that if they are right now making a really great profit, they would probably rather not have agriculture inspectors over there or have to submit documents to public authorities or share their data than to actually get more money. I just heard this week from some very, very strong livestock farmers, dairy farmers in a very productive area. And this is a real difficulty for the people that the gentleman from DG Agri mentioned, who are implementing the new delivery model of the CAP. Because you do try to design good AECCs, you do try to design good eco schemes, but at the end of the day, when farmers actually sit down and look at what the practices are, even if you put a small incentive effect, they are weighing it against other things. And I can tell you, cross-compliance, for example, is one of the things that really puts them off. They would rather not have a lot of control and oversight than to have to do that. So my question, David, is also, when you put forward the idea of the new funding source, which is going to appeal, I think, to a lot of genuine farmers who are more willing to be progressive, how do we actually, let's say, not prevent, but prepare for what the main farming lobby is going to probably think and say, okay, we don't disagree with the idea of there being new money for farmers who voluntarily want to go and do something in terms of sustainability, in terms of reducing methane emissions, etc. But it has to be from outside the cap, and it has to be in addition to the existing funding. Because in the MFF negotiations, that will be, I think, one of the big, big problems. Because when finance ministers in the member states hear this kind of idea, normally the first reaction they have is, oh, but there is already 54 billion euros here in the cap, and that should be enough to have some really good policies and to drive the transition. Thanks.
Thank you. I think you're right to underline the importance of that debate, that argument, to underline the importance of the MFF as a key decision point. It isn't just about the cap. The two things run together and are inseparable. I think a lot of farming organizations will argue, as you suggest, nice to have more money, but not. I think what's going to make that argument more difficult to sustain is that there's a limit to the EU budget. We've talked about the Ukrainian dimension to the whole discussion. We are now taking on obligations which are quite real, which have costs for nature restoration, for meeting climate targets. They have to be paid for somewhere. So I don't think that the traditional farmer argument is going to have the monopoly of proposals here. Other people have a claim for the limited amount of EU funding, and I think in some member states there's some realization of that. And so we have to have a funding settlement which reflects the interests of the whole of European society and not just the traditional incumbents. But I'm not saying that's going to be an easy discussion at all.
Good morning. My name is Camille Perrin. I'm working with BERG, the European Consumer Organization. Thank you very much, David, for the extremely interesting presentation. We've been discussing a lot the fair transition for farmers so far, and I wanted to ask you whether you've formed any thoughts or reflection on how we can also ensure the transition is also just one for consumers. We've been discussing in the first panel about price signals, and it's totally true that today they are not the right ones. The example in France of dropping sales for organic food is a case in point, because organic is the most expensive option, not the most affordable one. And if we introduce some sort of carbon pricing mechanism or some sort of ETS for food, that will lead to an increase in prices for certain products, which should be for some products certainly, but how can we also ensure that part of the revenue that will be raised by such mechanism can be used to subsidize products that should be consumed more by consumers? And how can we support especially lower and middle income households to afford sustainable diets? So we need to make sure that transition is fair for both part of the chain. So I was wondering whether you have any thoughts to share on this. Thank you.
No, of course you're right that the consumer side of the equation is extremely important. Food prices are a critical issue, especially for certain communities. I mean, food prices as a proportion of household expenditure, food has gone down in most member states a lot, and we can't expect that process to go on and on to the point where we're not reflecting real production costs. I think so that there's an element of having to face real costs in the food system. There's an element of the food industry, and in my view, who are playing an extremely important role in choice editing, what's actually available on the table, of engaging them more in understanding what is a sustainable diet, and therefore helping to make that offer to their customers in a strategic way. They're quite capable of influencing diets in a way which they're not motivated to do right now. And we in fact, sometimes you'll see organic products on a huge premium, even though the actual production costs of whatever, the wheat or the sugar or whatever it is in a biscuit is quite low. So I do think that is part of the answer to that question. And we have to pay farmers properly for real production costs. We can't go away from that. We can't completely try to force food prices down below the level of viability. And where we see adjustments coming, I think we have to think of ways in which we can try to influence diets in the right way, get the industry involved in the right way, but we can't, at the end of the day, ignore the implications of a sustainable food production system. It is probably going to cost more, not in everything. And I've spoken to a lot of arable farmers, I don't know if Melanie would agree with that, who say they can actually, after a period of adjustment, they can run a regenerative system with pretty much same output costs as they've got today. Maybe slightly different, but certainly not as staggering. There are some systems, like livestock systems, where I think there will be significant increases of prices. So I don't think all of agriculture is exactly in that boat. There are different sectors, and there will be, again, winners and losers. I think we've got one more.
Hi. Claire McCunfill, I'm currently on a career break, but was previously in the Commission for 11 years and working on the interface between environment and agriculture. I had one reflection on your governance model. While I can see the instinct to move a part of the fund to be decided by environment and climate organizations, we are actually wanting a transition for food, not just transition for environmental protection. So I think there's a missing piece of governance, which is around, and I'm not sure that it actually exists in many member states, and that's part of the problem. And it's, what are the future food systems that we need? And the agriculture ministries are not thinking about this, but neither are the environment ministries. They don't have that expertise. So, and I'm not sure, I think the health departments may know part of the problems with the existing food systems that we have. So I think it was reflected by the farmer this morning on the panel. There is nobody to go to for this advice. There's also no ministry in charge of it. So I think it doesn't need to be a total block in going in the direction that you're talking about, but I think we need to recognize there is a real information and knowledge gap in this space. And then the second was just a question back to the Danish representative about this discussion about a carbon price on food. I think it has the potential to help address the elephant or the cow in the room. And I wonder, in Denmark, is there some discussion about the hypothecation of the tax back then to pay for advice or something else? Because I think in the past, I don't know if it was Denmark or Sweden, the pesticide tax worked by providing the funding for the advisory service. So this is potentially a way of getting over this issue. So a bit more information on what's being considered in Denmark.
Do you want to go first, Simone?
Yeah. A possible new tax on agriculture emissions would go back to the farmers in one way or another, but you cannot directly take the money and give to the farmers. It would be in support on research or innovation, or maybe promotion of the products that they produce that are then more sustainable, I would imagine. So they are talking about that, it also depends on what kind of model they're going for. There is this expert group that's going to suggest either or give recommendations whether it's going to be a production tax on the on-farm level, or a consumption tax. And maybe they would recommend both solutions. I see kind of great potential in doing both, to kind of shift diets on the one side, and to push production to be more sustainable and reduce emissions. So, but that would probably also be difficult politically to push for both taxes.
And just on your point about the governance and the food system, and in a way our model is, it's quite simplistic. It's kind of a starting point, and you would need the holistic. You'd need the right people around the table to run and food is there. But I think we haven't quite taken this food debate to the next step. I mean, as you know, the EU's competence for food is quite extensive, but also quite narrow. So we have a rather complicated division of responsibilities in the EU and the member states, and that's going to be reflected in what happens in the member state governance. But generally, I think you're right. We don't see health ministries in Europe and health authorities very much involved in these sorts of discussions. Their voice isn't really heard, and so that's a gap to be thought about. if we had a kind of overarching vision of a sustainable food system, I hate to come back to this, that would be very helpful at a European level. So we knew there was a kind of consensus, and I'm not going to repeat what Faustine's already said. We don't know whether this is going to happen or not, but at least that would be a suitable frame. So let's hope that either in this commission or the next commission or sometime this side of never, we do actually get that kind of framing to help us bring food into that dimension. And I'm going to stop there while I'm able to, and Harriet's going to finish us off. Thanks for asking interesting questions.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone. I would just like to close with some reflections, obviously, on the day and the debates and how we take this forward. And starting just by saying that my interest in the whole issue of agriculture and food systems started when I was doing my master's degree and started looking into sustainability challenges. And what made me so interested in this one above all others was the fact that food is also an existential need for humans as well. So we have to feed ourselves. We need, obviously, to produce enough food, but at the same time, it is at the heart of so many of the sustainability challenges we face. So the complexity, I think, of this topic is something that made me think, well, this is what I want to work on. And maybe it's a similar story as well for many people in the room today who have dedicated their careers to this or starting to. So it is a complex area, and I think today also has obviously just drawn out that there's different challenges to be met at the same time. How can we try and do these in a complementary way? What will be some of the trade-offs? I think that we need to embrace this complexity and challenges going forward, and I think that there's been a lot of mention of polarization, which has been unhelpful in these debates, which has simplified the issues to a level where we aren't moving forward with constructive solutions in policy terms. So I would say that what we've tried to do in the work that we've been doing here, and I think going forward, is just trying to meet somewhere further into the middle and have a debate between a lot of different viewpoints, try and think how we can move forward constructively and in a way that is obviously more effective in addressing the challenges that we do face. We've talked a lot about this grand débat, so we think that is something that needs to start now, and that having that happening at European level, as it has started to happen in some member states, would be a way also to just agree between stakeholders in a very participatory process, a sort of more concrete vision of where we need to get to for our agriculture, food and land use systems. So we've spoken about that. We've spoken about the need for constructive debates, and I think that's where we really need to go now, and resist this temptation to engage in this more polarized debate. So that's the first thing. I think one of the key, obviously, messages from today, and that we know, is that we need a range of policies in order to try and support, drive, help the transition that we need to see, and that we need to see coherence between them. So obviously we need policies outside of the CAP, as we've said, along the food chain, and that we need to make sure that the CAP is more coherent as well with them, and it can become an engine of change. So when it comes to the CAP itself, I think what is quite clear, is that there is obviously a way forward, in the sense that we know that there is funds available. We know that the transition is possible. I think, Melanie, you were underlining this, but we've also underlined that takes time. So I think understanding much better going forward what exactly are those resources that are needed from farmers, but also other actors, probably in the food chain and knowledge, etc., in order to make these changes. And how do we try and unlock some of those barriers that might be holding people back and using the funds for those ends? So I think we can be positive that a way forward is possible, and we need to use this next decade to be that transition and not delay it further, but do acknowledge that we need to understand people's constraints and that this will take time, and that obviously we need to think about this from a longer term perspective of transition too. We've presented one option today, which has come out of a process of debate with a number of experts and think tanks. And this option is one which we think could be workable and should be part of the debate going forward when the Commission is working on ideas for the future of the CAP. It's not the only one, of course. There will be many different ideas. They will all have their pros and cons, and now the process needs to be to go into more detail of the different issues. What are the pros and cons of different policy options and frameworks going forward? Let's have a constructive debate with different stakeholders about those and try and really understand them more. I think one thing that also has come up today and that needs to be borne in mind when we go forward at this stage where we're quite early in the process and we have that chance to think a little bit bigger and more outside of the box, is that we will be facing a different external environment in the coming decade than we have been facing up until now. Things that are maybe seem not imaginable today will become possible, and we have seen this, for example, with the COVID pandemic, that the response that was required by that obviously required mobilization of resources from the EU that people would have said was impossible before. And the crisis that obviously we face now requires the same consideration of as yet options that don't seem particularly easy, let's say, but are necessary. So I think now is the moment to think big, to consider these options, to have a real debate involving a range of different stakeholders going forward. And so we're at this perfect moment. I want to thank everybody for being involved in this process with us. So the expert group, our TSE partners and other think tanks who we're working with on this. Thanking also the IUP team, who's done a fantastic job supporting us both with the development of our ideas and also with the organization of this event today and the publication of this paper. And finally, also the speakers who have given a brilliant contribution. And I think, we've really enjoyed the debate, and we've already heard from people in the audience that it's been really stimulating. So we hope that over lunch you'll stay with us. That starts now. And that will give you the opportunity to obviously connect with people in the room, and let's definitely take this discussion forward and keep these conversations going, including even widening it out to a broader audience. Thank you.